The Pritchard family have been haunted by Mr. Nobody for nearly 2 years. Up until now, they've never felt threatened by the entity. But that is about to change. The family are sat together in the living room when 15-year-old Diane gets up to get a glass of water from the kitchen. But as soon as she leaves the room, all the lights in the house go out. Then from the hallway, they hear a sudden gasp, followed by a thud on the staircase. And that's when the screaming starts. They rush into the hall and see Diane being dragged up the stairs by her hair, as if being pulled by invisible hands. Her father Joe and her brother Philip try to pull her back down, but they're both thrown backwards. All of a sudden, Diane's screams become choked, and she starts gasping for air. Deep red bruises start forming around her throat in the shape of unnaturally large hands. Diane's face is turning purple. Then Philip gets an idea. If it can touch them, maybe they can touch it. In a final act of desperation, he reaches for whatever's choking his sister. His hands touch something solid, yet unseen. Whatever it is, it's freezing cold. As soon as he does this, the entity releases its grip on Diane. But the Black Monk is far from finished. Welcome to Paranormal FM, your home of the strange, unexplained, and all things that go bump in the night. This is a terrifying story of the Black Monk, Britain's most violent poltergeist. This haunting is one of the most violent ever recorded, but due to the sheer number of credible witnesses, from the clergy to the police, and even a member of Parliament, it's also one of the most believable. And tonight, we're going to cover it all, from the start of the haunting to the escalating violence, and finally, the theories around who or what the Black Monk actually was. It's the 27th of August 1966, and Joe and Jean Pritchard, along with their 2 children, 15-year-old Philip and 12-year-old Diane, have just moved in to 30 East Drive, a 3-bedroom home in the Yorkshire market town of Pontefract. Now, it's worth clarifying how the Pritchards acquired the home, because this detail becomes very relevant later on. 30 East Drive is a council house, which means it's part of the public housing system managed by the local government. In this system, a family can request a swap if their current home is too small. And with Diane having just turned 12, the Pritchards are in desperate need of a 3rd bedroom. So when they put in their request and are told that there's a family willing to swap homes with them, they're understandably delighted. But as soon as they walk through the door, they're met with a strange sight. The previous tenants have left all of their furniture behind. There are half-packed moving boxes left open on the table, and their belongings are thrown all over the house. Jean is a house-proud woman, and she's frustrated by the mess. But as she and Joe have a weekend away, she won't have time to clean. Her mother Sarah arrives a short time later to keep an eye on Philip, who, at 15, has lost interest in family holidays. And it's while Jean and Joe are away that Philip and his grandmother experience the first signs of something strange in the house. It's approximately 4 p.m, and Philip is in the kitchen making a cup of tea. He calls out to his grandmother to ask if she wants one, but when she doesn't answer, he assumes she's too absorbed in her knitting to hear him. He walks into the living room to ask again, but what he sees makes him freeze in his tracks. There is a thick cloud of what he would later describe as a white, powdery substance falling on his grandmother. The strange thing is it isn't falling from the ceiling. It's just manifesting in the air above her head and coating her hair, dress, and surrounding carpets. But strangest of all is that she appears to be completely oblivious to this. It's almost as if she's in some sort of trance. Philip's now thoroughly creeped out and asks what she's doing. His grandmother looks up with a start, like someone being woken from a dream, then looks down at her lap and sees the white dust coating her legs and the surrounding floor. She assumes it's just plaster falling from the ceiling, but there's no cracks or peeling paint to explain the strange white powder. Nonetheless, she quickly sweeps it up, but when she turns back, the floor is once more covered in the strange white dust. Curious to see what it could be, she reaches out and touches it, then quickly pulls back her hand. The dust is unnaturally cold, almost like dry ice. She sweeps it up again, and again it returns. By now, both her and Philip are starting to feel uncomfortable, so they go across the road and fetch Philip's aunt, Marie Kelly, who lives opposite. When she first sees the strange powder on the floor, she, like his grandmother, thinks nothing of it. But when she enters the kitchen, things go from strange to impossible. While in the kitchen, she suddenly slips on a puddle of water that wasn't there moments ago. She mops it up, but it forms again right in front of her. She assumes it's a leaking pipe, but the pools of water continue to form even after the water mains are turned off. She calls the water board, and they send an inspector around immediately. But he can't find anything to explain where the water is coming from. In the end, he blames it on condensation and leaves. An hour later, the pools of water vanish as mysteriously as they first appeared. And Aunt Marie, assuming the problem has fixed itself, goes home. But the strange events are only just getting started. At around 7, Philip calls out to his grandma in a panic. She finds him staring, wide-eyed, into the kitchen. Sugar and tea leaves are flying across the countertops, and the kitchen cupboards are being slammed, open and closed. Then they hear a massive crash from the hallway. The large potted plant that was placed by the front door has been hurled halfway up the stairs. and the heavy ceramic pot that once contained it lay smashed on the landing. They call Marie back, but the activity stops as soon as she arrives. It's like whatever it is playing with them. Marie leaves, and things appear to have gone back to normal. But a few hours later, the silence is broken once more by loud bangs coming from Philip's bedroom. When they enter his room, they see the massive, heavy oak wardrobe vibrating with an intensity that reverberates in their chests. It suddenly lurches forwards, only a couple of inches at first, but then it starts swaying side to side and begins marching towards them in a rhythmic, jerky motion. Then a gust of cold air, coming from seemingly nowhere, pushes both Philip and his grandma. This is the final straw, and the two run across the road to Marie's house. They're so terrified that they don't even stop to put on their shoes. Marie hears them before she sees them, and when she looks outside and sees her mother and nephew running across the road screaming in terror with only slippers on their feet, she knows that something is seriously wrong. When they tell her what happened, she agrees they can stay the night. But what happens next is one of the strangest aspects of the haunting. While they're all sat in Marie's living room trying to calm down, an icy cold wind suddenly moves through the home. Then a strange white dust appears in the air. The same white dust that Philip had seen coating his grandma earlier in the evening. Now remember, this is the first time Marie has actively seen the phenomena for herself. And now she's terrified. Because whatever it is, it's just followed them into her home. They eventually stay with a neighbour called Mrs. Hunt, as it was the only way Philip and his grandma felt they could get any sleep. But perhaps most disturbingly is that once the house is empty, neighbours who'd come outside to see what the commotion was about report seeing a yellowish, dim light moving through the home, like that of someone holding a candle, as well as a tall, dark shadow, much larger than any man, moving past the upstairs windows. When Joe and Jean Pritchard return home and hear about what's happened, they aren't scared. In fact, they're furious. Joe's convinced it's an elaborate prank being played on the family and tells them to stop talking rubbish. To put this into perspective, the Pritchards are a typical Yorkshire family, which, for those of you unfamiliar, means they are the epitome of no nonsense. Joe calls the police to report a burglary or vandalism, and two officers, PC Michael Horsfall and PC Ian Broadhead, arrive a short time later. They're in the living room taking Joe's statement when a heavy brass candlestick suddenly lifts off the mantelpiece and flies across the room, narrowly missing one of the officers. But they don't see this as evidence of a haunting. They see this as confirmation that whoever's playing a prank on the family is still in the home, and they immediately start a room-by-room sweep of the house. Finally, they reach Philip's bedroom on the upper floor, and just as they're inspecting the room, the heavy oak wardrobe starts vibrating. And just like before, it lurches forward towards the two officers. This was clearly enough for one day, and the officers quickly leave the house, saying that it wasn't a police matter. In other words, they can't arrest a ghost. But Joe, ever the skeptic, refuses to accept a supernatural explanation. He checks behind the wardrobe and under the floorboards for wires, or anything that could explain the wardrobe's movements, but finds nothing. He then tapes fine cotton threads across the doorways and hallways of the home, and puts down flour to catch the footprints of any intruders. Nonetheless, objects continue to move on their own, and when he checks the threads, they're still intact, and the flour is untouched. Joe remains skeptical, but what comes next proves, once and for all, that there is something paranormal taking place in the home. A short time later, Jean's sister, Maude Preece, visits the family. She's a devout Christian and prominent member of the Salvation Army. She believes there can only be one of two explanations for what's going on. Either the children are playing pranks on the family, or the family were not maintaining a godly household. But whatever the reason, she's the solution. She starts by gathering the family in the kitchen and begins scolding the children for scaring their parents. The children insist it's not them, but she's not having any of it. That was until a jug of milk, sitting on the kitchen table, levitates in the air, then slowly tilts and empties itself all over her head. Maude, now drenched in milk, is stunned into silence, before saying, "This house is infested with evil." Her skepticism is now replaced by a manic, religious fervour. She quickly ushers them into the living room and commands them to sing the hymn, "Onward Christian Soldiers," believing that holy music will drive the evil out. It's not long until she gets a reaction, although it's probably not the reaction she was hoping for. A pair of Jean's fur-lined gloves appear around the edge of the living room door, and as the family's singing intensified, rather than being repelled by the music, the gloves start to mockingly conduct the family's singing, waving up and down in tune with the song. Maude removes one of her boots and hurls it at the gloves in frustration. But as soon as she does this, the tone shifts from mockery to menace. The gloves stop conducting. One glove forms into a fist, while the other makes a slow, beckoning motion, as if daring her to come closer. The gloves eventually fall to the floor, and Maude, convinced they are now tainted with evil, takes them outside and burns them to ash. By now, newspapers are reporting on the haunting, turning it into a local sensation. East Drive becomes a circus, with hundreds of people lining the streets, hoping to see some of the phenomena for themselves. Some neighbours even start charging people a small fee to stand in their gardens to get the best view of what the press has christened the House of Fear. The newspaper reports attract the attention of Joe Harper, the MP for Pontefract. Harper visits the home intent on debunking the haunting. But while he's there, he witnesses a heavy sideboard vibrating and moving right in front of him, and he too is unable to provide an explanation for what he saw. This is a significant development, because this is the second time a skeptical person in an official position of authority has visited the home and experienced something they couldn't explain. But he would be far from the last. The family have come to accept that their home is haunted. They invite their local vicar to bless the home. He too was initially skeptical, possibly thinking it was a media story that got out of hand. But when two heavy brass candlesticks lift off the mantelpiece and float in midair, right in front of his face, he quickly starts a blessing of the home. The blessing, however, seems to have little effect, and once the family realise the entity isn't going anywhere, they give it a nickname. They call it Fred. Now, while this may seem odd to my American audience, this is a quintessentially British thing to do. After all, saying you have a mischievous pet poltergeist called Fred is far less frightening than admitting you're under attack by a demonic entity. But then, one day, the activity stopped as suddenly as it started, and as the days turned into months, the family allowed themselves to believe that perhaps the haunting was finally over. Unfortunately, this was just the eye of the storm, and when the haunting resumed 2 years later, it would be far darker and more violent in nature. It's late October 1968, and the family are sleeping soundly in their beds. Fred is slowly becoming a distant, albeit unwelcome memory. But the peace in their home is suddenly shattered by a heavy thundering that wakes the entire house. They would later describe it as sounding like a sack of coal or dead body being dragged across the floorboards. The first sign that the haunting has started again is a manifestation of the strange white dust and an ice-cold breeze that flows through every room of the house. Then, in a sign of things to come, the activity focuses on the bedroom door of Diane, who's now 15 years old. The handle turns back and forth as if someone is trying to burst inside, and the door rattles with such force that it nearly comes off its hinges. But this time, it's not just the Pritchards who are affected. Their next-door neighbours, the Vicars, in number 32, are also awoken by the noises. And before long, the activity spreads into their home. The Vicar's teenage daughter, Carol, is most notably affected, experiencing what she described as a palpable heaviness and unnatural cold that seemed to seep through the walls. And as the haunting continues, glowing balls of blue light begin manifesting in her bedroom. Fred is back, but there's something different about him. He carries a darker, heavier energy to the one they encountered 2 years earlier. It doesn't take long for the haunting to escalate. One of the most bizarre occurrences is a persistent green sludge bubbling out of the taps and toilets, and over the following days, objects are teleported around the home. In the kitchen, raw eggs materialise in mid-air, then fly across the room and smash against the walls and ceiling. And other objects, such as pieces of coal and dried up oranges, are teleported through locked doors. But when the furniture starts moving again, Joe Pritchard begins fearing for the safety of his family. He once more calls the police, hoping that they can provide some form of protection. The officer who attends is PC Anthony Gill, and as soon as he enters the home, he experiences what he would later report as a cold, heavy atmosphere. Then, as he takes their statements, a large, heavy wooden sideboard begins vibrating, then levitates before moving slowly across the room. Gill immediately checks the floor and the back of the sideboard, but he can't find anything that could explain the movement. And just like the officers who visited the home in 1966, he tells the family that there's nothing he can do, and that the situation is not a police matter. It's following this visit that the haunting shows the first signs it's becoming violent. It starts with the disturbing sounds of animals in distress. The family frequently hear the whines of a wounded dog coming from the walls, even though neither the Pritchards nor their neighbours have any pets. Things quickly progressed from disturbing to terrifying when the family find their belongings torn apart. Clothes, curtains, and even wallpaper are found shredded, as if by large claws. And in one particularly unsettling event, while Diane and Jean were attempting to redecorate Diane's bedroom, a strip of wallpaper is physically ripped from the wall by an invisible force and then begins to writhe and twist in midair, in a manner which they would later describe as almost snake-like. The events in the home progress further, from terrifying to dangerous, when knives from the kitchen start manifesting in mid-air before being thrown at family members. The knives are thrown with such force that they end up embedded in the walls. Now, whether this was intended as a threat or a deliberate attempt to injure the family, or worse, is up for debate. But what comes next leaves the family in no doubt as to the insidious nature of the entity that now infests their home. They start to notice strange marks appearing on the surfaces around the home. They initially think they're just scratches caused by the violent activity, but when they look more carefully, they realise these aren't random scratches. These are symbols, and more specifically, the symbol of an upside-down cross. Before long, they find this symbol all over the home. It's gouged into the wood of the banisters, doors and sideboards. And a short time later, they find huge upside-down crosses painted on the walls of the home. It's clear that whatever they're dealing with is demonic, and the family contact the Catholic Church for help. Father Herbert, a Catholic priest, arrives a short time later, and as the family leads him through the house, the first thing he notices is that same dark, heavy atmosphere felt by all the other visitors to the home. And when they show him the upside-down crosses gouged into the woodwork and painted onto the walls, he's in no doubt that there's a demonic presence in the home. Unfortunately, he's unable to perform an exorcism without permission from the church, so instead, he performs a blessing of the home. But almost as soon as he begins, the entity makes its displeasure known, and rather than becoming weaker, it gets stronger and more aggressive. The house erupts into violence and deafening bangs, and when he sees the brass candlestick levitating off the mantelpiece, he leaves the house in terror. The Pritchards are once more on their own, and the presence in their home is more powerful than ever. And before long, it focuses its attention on the Pritchards' 15-year-old daughter, Diane. Her experiences constitute some of the most violent and disturbing examples of poltergeist activity ever recorded. So before we continue, I need to warn you that the nature of these attacks could be distressing to some viewers. It was following the blessing that the Black Monk that came to epitomise the haunting begins to make itself known. Diane complains of a presence that she would later describe as dark and predatory in her room. She can't see it, but she can feel it, staring hatefully at her from the shadows. The feeling's so intense that she's too afraid to sleep, and begins suffering from severe sleep deprivation. When she does eventually fall asleep, she's either tipped out of bed or wakes to find her entire bed moved to the other side of the room. Then, one night, Diane sees the Black Monk for the first time. She's alone in her room, and the hateful, predatory presence is stronger than ever. But this time, she feels it emanating from a single point, the corner of her room. She instinctively looks over, and stood in the corner is a hooded figure that she described as being 7 foot tall, but most disturbingly, that it has no face. From this point, the Black Monk turns her life into a waking nightmare. The following night, she suddenly wakes to find the monk hovering over her bed, its faceless hood hovering inches from her face. She screams out in terror, and it slowly drifts back through a wardrobe. Now at this point, it's worth reviewing a few important aspects that make this case stand out. And while it's often referred to as a poltergeist case, there are a couple of details that indicate there could be more to it than that. The first is the intense reaction to religious symbolism, followed by the upside-down crosses scratched into the wood and painted around the house. The second is the systematic psychological torture of Diane, followed by the manifestation of the terrifying, faceless Black Monk. This fits more with the infestation and oppression stages of a demonic possession. The violence reaches a whole new level when the entity tries to strangle Diane in her sleep. Her parents, hearing her gasp for air, rush into her room and see red, finger-shaped bruises forming on her throat. It's following this attack that they once more try blessing the home. But what comes next is possibly the strongest indication yet that whatever's in their home is a force far darker than a poltergeist. While the family are blessing the home, Diane suddenly cries out in pain while holding her chest. And when she lifts up her top to inspect the area, they find a cross burned into her skin. But this is just a sign of things to come. A short time later, Diane is alone in her room when all of a sudden the lights go out. This is quickly followed by a huge crash and Diane's terrified screams. Her parents rush into the bedroom, and as they do, the lights flicker back on, and they find Diane now trapped under a huge oak dresser. The dresser looks like it's been thrown across the room to intentionally trap Diane in place. But stranger still is the vintage sewing machine, perfectly placed on top of the dresser. Her parents remove the sewing machine and desperately try to lift the dresser, but they can't move it. It feels like there's an invisible force holding it in place. When they finally lift the dresser, they're expecting the worst. But incredibly, aside from being shaken, Diane is completely unharmed. As the violence towards Diane continues to escalate, the family place crosses around their home, desperately hoping to ward off the Black Monk. But each time the family attempts to protect Diane with religious icons, the Black Monk responds more violently. One of the most famous examples of this was one time when Diane was in the living room. A heavy brass crucifix, which had been placed on the mantelpiece, suddenly flies across the room, violently hitting her in the back. But rather than falling to the floor, it sticks to her back, as if held in place by an unseen force. When the crucifix is finally pulled off, they find a bruise in the exact shape of the cross, which remains there for several days. The message is clear. Holy objects have no power over the Black Monk. The violence peaks with Diane being pulled up the stairs by her hair, as we described at the start. But the story doesn't end there, because after the Black Monk releases its grip on Diane, Joe is tending to her injuries. He suddenly looks up, and standing on the landing is the Black Monk. This is the first time he's seen it for himself. And it isn't an accident. This is the Black Monk gloating at the power it has over the family. It's proven it has complete control over not only the house, but everyone who lives there. And there is nothing they can do to protect Diane or themselves. This is the moment when the family accepts defeat and stops trying to fight the Black Monk. The violence dies down, but the Black Monk continues to make itself known. Diane Pritchard starts to see the Black Monk standing in the doorways to their home, emanating what she describes as a feeling of absolute soul-crushing despair. And Joe Pritchard starts to see its reflection in the mirrors of the home. But every time he turns around, it's no longer there. And the Pritchards aren't the only ones to see it. The neighbours also report seeing a large, faceless entity wearing a black robe staring at them from the bedroom windows. But one question still remains. Who or what is the Black Monk? It's only when local researcher Tom Cuniff takes an interest in the case that the truth about the Black Monk is finally revealed. And what he uncovers is arguably even more disturbing than the haunting. Cuniff's research shows that the house is built right over where the town's gallows once stood, and it was at these gallows that a monk was executed for the assault and murder of a teenage girl in the 16th century. This revelation made the context of the attacks on 15-year-old Diane Pritchard all the more disturbing. And as it turns out, the Pritchards aren't the only family to have been tormented by the Black Monk. The family who lived there before the Pritchards also had several frightening experiences in the home. In fact, things got so bad that they left the house to stay with friends, leaving all their belongings behind. And this has been verified by neighbours who reported seeing them leaving in the middle of the night. The reason the house was a mess when the Pritchards moved in wasn't because the previous tenants were lazy or messy. It was because they were too terrified to be there a second longer. The family who lived there before consisted of Bill and Barbara Farrer and their 2-year-old daughter Jane. And what they experienced in the home is arguably just as disturbing as what the Pritchards experienced. In addition to objects moving in the home and clothes being torn, the entity took a particularly sinister interest in 2-year-old Jane. Bill and Barbara started to be woken by the pained screams of their daughter in the middle of the night, and when they went to investigate, they found bloody scratches over her face and body. It was as if she were attacked by an animal. This was despite having no pets in the house. Each night before bed, they checked the windows are shut and even put mittens on Jane's hands, just in case she was somehow doing it to herself. Yet the scratches keep appearing. Then, one night, Barbara hears muffled cries coming from Jane's room. She runs upstairs and sees something invisible smothering Jane with a pillow. This is the final straw for the family, and they leave that very night. So, what really happened at 30 East Drive? The Pritchards ended up staying in the house, living in an uneasy truce with the Black Monk, until Jean Pritchard moved to a nursing home and their son Philip sold the house to Bill Bungay in 2012. Incidentally, Bungay released the film When the Lights Went Out in the same year, which is a dramatised retelling of the Pritchards' experiences in the house. Bungay also co-authored a book with Richard Estep, which is titled The Black Monk of Pontefract, the world's most violent and relentless poltergeist. On the face of it, it has shades of the Amityville horror, with book deals and movies based on the haunting. But there are some important differences. Firstly, there is the vast number of witnesses who had nothing to gain by coming forward. We have statements from various members of the clergy, 2 separate statements from the police, and even a member of Parliament, all going on record to report paranormal experiences in the house. It's hard to see why they'd risk their reputation so publicly if they hadn't truly seen something they couldn't explain. Then we have the Pritchards' reports of seeing the Black Monk, which was later verified by research conducted by Tom Cuniff. There's no way they could have known about the monk's crimes and subsequent execution before they moved in. And finally, we have the Farrers' accounts of experiencing similar events in the house. The Farrers' account is particularly compelling because they didn't come forward of their own volition. They were tracked down by researchers and gave their accounts nearly a decade after the Pritchards' experiences made headlines. This is significant because if the Farrers wanted to make money, piggybacking off the Pritchard story, they would have come forward when the story was in the news. The fact they never came forward and only talked about it when asked, makes for a very credible account. They, like many of the other witnesses associated with this case, had nothing to gain from their story, and they've never made any money or sought any sort of publicity since. This is why the haunting of 30 East Drive is regarded as one of the most credible hauntings ever recorded. And if 30 East Drive really is haunted, then what's the nature of the haunting? This is the part of the case that interests me the most, because it's not quite a poltergeist case, and it's not quite a demonic infestation either, but it has elements of both. It has poltergeist activity surrounding a teenager, but also intense demonic activity with regards to the violent response to religious artifacts. And of course, the Farrer family had no teenagers in their household, yet they also reported similar activity to the Pritchards. Today, the house has been reinvented as a paranormal attraction. They host ghost hunts and even overnight stays. Think Airbnb, but you need to bring your own bedding and sign a safety waiver before entering. A bit like Hauntings, or a sketchy motel along Route 66. Visitors have captured all manner of ghostly phenomena, ranging from growls, photographs of a ghostly girl called Emma, who's believed to have been the girl killed by the monk, shadow figures, monk-like forms, and light anomalies. In fact, the organisers have a website that's documented 288 instances of unexplained phenomena reported by visitors. I've included the link in the video description for anyone who's interested. So, what do you think is going on? A violent poltergeist? A demonic presence? A bit of both? Or maybe something completely different? Either way, I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments below. That's all from Paranormal FM. Thank you for spending your evening with me. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like, hype, and subscribe, and be sure to join me next time.